Good morning, everybody. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG. And today it is another episode of The World in Around 80 Days. This is my world building series helping you develop the world you want in as short a period as possible. And I'm using the number around 80 days in perhaps a glib fashion. We would probably have covered the majority of subjects before then, but then again, those of us that are accomplished, or at least attempting to be accomplished game masters, know that you really never ever complete on the creation process. But today we're going to be looking at something that is actually quite common in role-play sessions, and that is issues of timekeeping. And our reason for covering that in the world creation phase is that we have to develop, at least at some level, a comprehension of the passage of time over time. In other words, if you are setting up a story and you're saying that the events that happened at this particular location happened 3 days ago or 30 years ago, there are considerable differences in the state and the condition of the evidence that might be found there. And so we need to have a way of talking about this in ways so that not only you as the creator, but the players themselves can keep a clear understanding of how much time is passing. And there are several kind of key elements to this that are tangible and visible to the players. And we're going to talk about those in particular because it's sort of a mechanism for you as the game master to set the tempo and give the players the idea of how much time they have remaining to accomplish whatever it is they're trying to do in order to keep with the chronology that you've kind of set in place. Now, before we even get to that, I do want to take a few minutes and talk about the creative element of time. And the first of those is how much time is time for the story you want to tell. In other words, are you using old or at least ancient in the framework of the personas that are in your game? Are there things that you have planned such that the players might have experienced? For example, in the case of the world of Nykos, in particular, we have a situation that occurred, and when it occurred, it was literally a chronological thing that happened because the players chose to do it. A player dedicated himself specifically to meeting all of the requirements in the player's handbook for utilizing a wish. He planned for everything, the loss of his energy, the vulnerability he was going to suffer afterwards, and so on. So he had built out all of the pieces for this effect. And when a player goes to that level and that extent of accuracy, it's really best if you can also maintain that for them. So I guess you'd say if you were going to do a comparison, it would be we could make a comparison to the Gettysburg Address. I know it's a really strange place to go, but in the case of the Gettysburg Address, it was a relatively short presentation, and that short presentation occurred on a specific morning in a certain year. And although I don't have the date of the Gettysburg Address memorized, I do have vast chunks of it still in my head because the date was not what the teachers wanted us to remember. It was the actual words of the speech, because it's such an impactful presentation and it encompassed all of the ideals of communication that most educators would want you to maintain. The concept of brevity, the concept of wit is opposite, the concept of clarity, the concept of emotion and presentation. All of this is encapsulated in that speech. My point is this: that speech occurred on a certain morning, on a certain day, and yet one of the lines in it, I think possibly my favorite line in it, is, "Men will little note nor longer remember the things we say here, but they can never forget what they did here." What's ironic is that more people, I think, remember the actual words of the speech, even this far down the road. They capture and they held on to parts of the words, but they don't necessarily recall the drama and the dynamics that occurred at the battlefield of Gettysburg in the days before Lincoln's speech. And I see that as a great parallel in the world of Nikos, because that person who went through the endeavor of the wish actually utilized his wish to speak his message. It was actually longer than Gettysburg's speech, but his intent was the same: to create a message that would span all of history thereafter. And that kind of magnitude, that kind of intensity in a singular moment is completely lost if you don't show it the due respect or give it a means to have that gravitas. So in the case of the broadcaster's speech, it's the message of it, the initial message of it, was that you shouldn't trust newcomers, and you should always fear that which you do not know, and you should take action against those whose agenda you don't know. And and it was a great speech. Don't get me wrong. I've still got a recording of it. If you go over to NycosRPG.com and start digging through the videos there, I know I've got a lot, like 700, but it is in one of the presentations, and I'll try to flag it for you to make it easier. But I believe that you could find it just by looking through. It was during a campaign long ago, and I believe I actually made a short version as well, where I just captured the presentation itself. But it was amazing, and in order for me to show the gravitas of that event, I intentionally expanded the amount of time between iterations that wouldn't have been there otherwise, because we had players who were actually trying to carry over day-to-day living of beings from the 8th iteration into the 9th and make the transition to the new changes in the world. And well, that was a fun experience. I think next time around I won't endeavor to do that. I believe the 9th iteration will have to end with the personas of the story stepping out and literally resetting the world. But having said all of that, I want to talk therefore about timekeeping in your games. And one of the ways that has challenged players forever is the very concept of time. There are no wristwatches, generally speaking, in a fantasy setting. There's generally not even, rarely you'll find a clock tower in a location where somebody's actually used gears, widgets, and cogs and came up with a timekeeping device. And usually it's monstrously large and very cumbersome and is only locally available. So timekeeping becomes problematic. One of the ways, I argue one of the best ways, is to require journaling by at least one of the players in each of your groups. Optimally, it doesn't have to be a single player's duty to do that journaling. It could be a collective process. In the adventures that I run in the world of Nycos, I use my Discord channel has separate rooms or separate text channels for each of the adventuring groups. Pardon me. Got something in my eye. These wait. Okay. Self-check. Sorry about that. So because the rooms, the text channels are available, the players keep a running tally of what's going on in each adventure, and generally I pop in at the end of each session to put a note in about where we are so that I can remember what's going on. But this concept of keeping a chronology also gives the players an opportunity to see how much time they've expended in the game by literally going back and seeing how many months they've been at it. Because the campaign arcs are roughly 7 years, my players do have plenty of time to work on things. But as time passes, they start to feel the tempo adjust. Either it becomes more frenetic or it calms down depending on where they are in the story. And therefore the ebb and flow of actual time is seen in such a fashion. By keeping a track of that, you can also track your own progress in terms of how far the players are progressing in the story you're trying to tell. But now let's talk about the things that the players actually can see and can take care of. And one of the first ones, and going back in the day when Dungeons & Dragons was young, it was probably the most consistent way of tracking time passage, and that was access to lighting sources, torches, lanterns, that kind of thing. Even magical effects that created light were used, but they were considerably shorter in duration, with the possible exception of the ultra cheesy continual light. And we can deal with that at a later time, dealing with players' magical effects. But timekeeping challenges, torches, and lighting. Now, how long does an actual torch last? In Indiana Jones, it lasts for the entire scene, whatever that scene is. So if they walk in holding a torch, it's still lit and doing fine when the scene is complete. Maybe 3 hours have passed. You don't actually see them quenching a torch and lighting another one. But this mechanic of tracking time by a light source is easy from one standpoint because it gives you a bracketed. If you say you burn 1 torch an hour, then when you have a passage of time that you approximate to have been an hour, then you just simply describe the guttering of the torch, that it seems to be running out of its initial fuel source or whatever. And therefore they're reminded how much time that's passing. But timekeeping is also resource tracking, and you'll notice in most of these I'll list both issues, the actual example and then the general topic. So lighting is absolutely important for adventuring, especially if you are going to be involved in having the adventurers in a dungeon crawl or passing through the mines of Moria, or however you want to translate that. The idea of having enough light to see, while in real life seems easy, in miniatures and even theater of the mind play, it's much more difficult. The narrative process doesn't lend itself to a passage of time. If I'm describing something, the amount of time I took to describe it probably does not equate anywhere near the few seconds that it took for the players to actually have taken in that information directly. So we really can't merge the two together or say that my half-hour diatribe on what the room looked like, including lighting and all of that, doesn't necessarily mean that it took that long for them to observe. So the realization that time is a fluid in terms of play. So you can compress it, you can expand it, you can draw it out, you can contort and twist it to your purposes, really belies the real secret. And the real secret here, and I think I'm safe to say, it doesn't matter unless you want it to matter. If you, as a game master, want them to be able to walk through an entire dungeon and see all of your creatures and recognize the color of the paint on the walls, etc., then so be it. That's going to happen. The timekeeping then is more for keeping your players honest, keeping your players on task and such. And so maybe perhaps the underground surfaces actually glow. Maybe there's a magical and enduring effect in the area that gives it the dull amount of light you need them to have to continue to play. But if you are wanting to emphasize their visceral tie to the surface, then by all means, keep track of, okay, that's been 10 minutes, you've got 50 minutes left on this torch. I mean, granted, in reality, torch creation was not a absolute science, and some of them would last an extra 20 minutes, and some of them would burn out early. But the idea of keeping the players to a set amount of any resource, and I think you'll see this when we carry to the others, but in torches, in particular, it's relatively easy. They've said that they have carried a group of torches below ground. They've determined they're going to keep one lit at all times, and that this player is going to be responsible for bearing the light. So he's the one who will be going through all of these transitions. So simple things like mentioning, some point during the adventure, hey, Rufus, you've been carrying the lantern for the last 3 or 4 hours. You've dutifully changed them out, but you realize that your personal stock is running a little bit low. You might want to consider looking for alternate sources. So whether that be talk with your other players, or whatever, you're going to want to start considering what you're going to do when you run out of light. Also realizing that this far in, you've utilized more than half of your light sources to get in. You realize you won't have enough to take care of the trip back. So bring that up. The players then, pardon me, morning stretch. The party will therefore have to come to grips with the speed at which they are running through light sources and such. More to the point for the adventurers is their ammunition, and arrows are a prime example. There are only so many arrows that can fit in a quiver, and only so many arrows that the person would carry overall. So keeping track of individual arrows is certainly an acceptable measure of time, right? Well, the challenge with that is threefold. Number one, players keeping track of arrows means that they are spending the due time required after each encounter to recover as many as they can. And for the longest time, I would make my players actually track every arrow, and I adjudicated that any critical failure, and there wasn't even such a thing in Dungeons and Dragons terms officially, but anytime there was a 1 on the 20, that arrow was going to be destroyed. Later I changed it to give the arrow the same saving throw as the player, which was stupid as well. So I finally have come to the resolution. What I do is I have them roll percentage dice and go with whatever percentage of the arrows that they fired in the round. So if they fired 8 arrows and they roll 17%, then they have only been able to find 1 to maybe 2 of the arrows that they fired in that round. Either because they're firing against concrete walls, so they've shattered, or they were damaged by the monster that they actually hit with them, etc., etc. So I just resolve it to a flat roll to resolve the problem. But now that leaves a completely different issue, and that is overall volume of arrows. But generally, somebody in the group has some method for getting additional resource. Either they've got a bag of holding that they've stuffed with extras, or they've got a haversack and they're carrying an extra quiver in a back patch someplace. Whatever, there's generally a way for them to keep them. But as I said before, and I'll say it again, and I'll sit closer to the camera for this, the number of arrows, just like the number of torches that the adventurers have, is only important at the point where you want it to be. So you can hand wave it, no big deal, you got plenty of arrows, or I'm not going to worry about whether you hunt them down. You obviously would do that, and you haven't noticed a marked lack. Right at the point where I decide that, okay, we should start having fun because the players have been on the adventure long enough that it's reasonable for them to have possibly run their ammunition down to where they have to track it more dearly. In which case, then we focus on that for a few rooms and maybe an adventure or two, and then I forget and we drop back. But the concept of your arrows and ammunition being a method of timekeeping is really not relevant because, number one, you're not always in a combat sequence every so many minutes, and so it's not reasonable to use that to clock out how much time has passed. You could, I suppose, argue that in terms of a long trek, if you're traveling miles and miles, then yes, possibility is you could run out in a matter of days or perhaps a week or two, but that's a different scale of time, isn't it? When it gets more dear to the players is when we're talking about their food. Granted, we as human beings pretty much, especially in North America, pretty much eat whenever we want to and have ample supply of product, whether it's high quality or low quality, whether it's cheap and easy to access or high priced and difficult. Food is not generally we don't normally have sustenance issues. Now, arguably, some of you who do some camping and such might have had situations where you've been up in the mountains or whatever and deprived yourself on accident because of not planning for trip details or some tragedy occurred on the field. The concept of using food rations and food supply as a track of time, again, is better at the macro scale than at the micro scale. Generally, for example, a sailing vessel will go to sea with enough stores to last for several months at sea without ever setting foot on land. It doesn't mean they don't amplify with fresh caught fish and mollusks or whatever. There's always a possibility to amplify your source in those ways. But for the most part, your raw supplies, your hardtack and biscuits and dried pork or whatever, salt pork, they do eventually run out, but they do so in the much larger scale. So unless we're only talking about whether or not you're going to get peckish after a meal, generally speaking, a day or two on the low side of rations isn't problematic. Now, I do have to make a specification that if we're talking about water and you are talking about desert setting or ultra dry climates, then yeah, there's a possibility that you could use water as a ration source for tracking in the microcosm of the matter of hours or days. But generally speaking, it's not necessarily optimal for that, but it does show the passage of time over the long haul. The last one's interesting, and the attempts that were made in early versions of Dungeons & Dragons to track the material components of a magical effect were quite whimsical, and I think they were, again, more about busy work and maybe some bookkeeping shenanigans. But in terms of most people in the play environment, I've not had them actually diligently tracking how many spiders' legs they have left, or how many wads of bubble gum they still have, or whatever, to affect the magics that they wish to. But if, on the other hand, you wanted to make it more poignant, then perhaps you would require them to track these items, and arguably you'd be more hard pressed to hold the line on something like that, especially if they are, throwing around the mid to high level spells that might have components that cost dearly. Most game masters I know, from my experience as a storyteller and game master, don't really pursue any of these, except for when the moment is ripe for such. So the reality is that the timekeeping of the players in the group have more to do with your manipulation of the storyline around them than of their need to be realistic. No person is playing a one-to-one character life comparison. They're not tracking the number of hours in gameplay, and then they have to play again in order to keep their chronology going. So timekeeping in our world and timekeeping in the games world really is a very subjective interaction, and therefore they're not bound to the same restraints. However, having an idea of what you want to have happen in the history of your world and whatever, the most poignant cases, and we'll probably end with this, the most poignant cases generally are when you're dealing with someone's demise. If you're finding a corpse in a location, the knowledge of how a person's body would decay over time. I know it sounds ghastly, but it does give you a much better idea of the passage of time. If the person's been dead a matter of hours, nothing's changed other than body temperature. If it's a matter of, it also depends on the climate. If it's ultra humid and ultra hot, then all these bets are off. But if you're talking about the horrors of death, then you're looking at a matter of days. The loss of the body fluid and all the gruesome. There are ways to know about the passage of time, and by knowing that, you can then translate for the players what they're actually observing, what they're actually smelling, if they have to deal with that, and so on. If we're talking longer away from the death than that, then you have to worry about things like, what's the humidity like in terms of mummification? Is the person's skin going to become dry and tight, or are they going to be melted away by the moisture and humidity and such in the area? And if you're talking weeks, now we're talking about whether or not the bones stay contiguous. If there are predators in the area, if there are opportunistic eaters in the area, it may not be. It may be separated by quite a distance, or it may be just pulled apart. It's all a matter of the chronology that you're trying to build. And in the longer, even still longer scale, was a preservation mode used? Was the person pumped full of formaldehyde, or was the person, laid in a vat of oil? What methods were used to try to preserve? Those things will affect the duration of the body's existence, and then ultimately, if you're talking years, if it's not an entombment process and you're just finding somebody who happened to die there, there's not going to be any evidence left of it whatsoever. Even the microbes will have been digested by the opportunistic beings in the area. unless there's some magical cause, and of course that's where the magic adventures come from, right? What exactly happened here so long ago? Recently, one of the most effective mechanisms I've discovered is the use of the mythology of psychometry, the idea that a person's objects, their things, and their possessions will carry the echo of their presence long after they're dead, and therefore I'm able to do some of my storytelling through devices and objects and the players, and as they interact with them, I give them the story bits that were necessary to be transferred. But the real element of time that we really need to talk about is the fact that we all run out of it, and we are at the end of this episode. We will talk more about these subjects in the future. This is the world in around 80 days, an episode here on NycosRPG. If you like what you're seeing, follow the channel, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel at NycosRPG. Check out the videos over there. There's 700, so there's lots for anything that you'd be interested in, any of that. Feel free to look at that. And then if you want to become a part of the world of Nykos, you can become a participant and a player. Through our Patreon program, we have live streams on Saturdays and Sundays that are dedicated to those players who are supporting us in that fashion, and we'd love to have you. If you can and are in the area, feel free to join us at Board Game Paradise on Mondays and Tuesdays for our live campaign events. And finally, if you want to know more about the property and the access to NycosRPG, check out our website at NycosRPG.com. Alrighty, this has been Jonathan Albin and NycosRPG, and we will see you next episode.